I spent the better part of 30 years sanding every project that left my shop. Every single one. I would work my way through the grits like it was some kind of ritual. 80, 120, 150, 220, sometimes all the way up to 320 if I was feeling particular about it. And I thought I was doing good work. Then about 6 years ago, I got invited to visit a traditional boatyard up in Maine. Small operation, maybe 5 guys, restoring wooden sailboats the old way. And I watched one of those men finish a mahogany transom panel with nothing but a steel scraper, no sandpaper anywhere in sight. When he was done, I ran my hand across that surface, and I, honest to goodness, could not believe what I was touching. It was smoother than anything I had ever produced with sandpaper, like polished stone. And when I asked him why they never sand, he looked at me like I had asked why they don't use butter knives to cut joinery. He said, "Sandpaper opens the wood up. We need it." Closed. That one sentence changed how I think about finishing wood. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly what those shipwrights do differently, why scraping produces a surface that sandpaper simply cannot match, and what is actually happening inside the wood at a cellular level when you choose one method over the other. Plus, stick around to the end, because I will show you a burnishing trick I learned from one of those boat builders that I have never seen in any woodworking book I own. Let us get into it. What we are talking about today is not just a boat building technique. It is a finishing philosophy that applies to every piece of wood you will ever put your hands on. Whether you are building furniture, cabinets, or trim work, understanding why shipwrights chose scraping over sanding will change how you look at that stack of sandpaper sitting on your bench. So let me start with where this approach comes from and why these men took it so seriously. Shipwrights have been scraping wood smooth for centuries, and I do not mean that loosely. We are talking about the Royal Navy dockyards at Portsmouth and Chatham going back to the 1700s, American clipper shipbuilders in the 1850s and 60s, Scandinavian boat builders whose traditions stretch back to the Viking age. Every one of these traditions arrived at the same conclusion independently. You do not sand a surface that needs to survive contact with water. Now think about that for a moment. These were not hobbyists debating finish quality on a weekend project. These were men whose livelihoods and lives depended on the wood holding up. A warship deck that rotted prematurely could mean the difference between making port and not. A hull plank that absorbed water faster than it should could compromise the integrity of the entire vessel. The stakes could not have been higher. The guiding principle behind everything they did was simple. A finished wood surface must shed water, not absorb it. Every decision they made about surface preparation pointed back to that single idea. And what they understood, long before we had microscopes to confirm it, was that how you prepare the surface determines whether the wood opens up to moisture or closes against it. When I stood in that boatyard in Maine and watched those men work, what struck me was not just the technique, it was the confidence. They did not second-guess the method. They did not wonder if maybe they should hit it with some 220 grit just to be safe. They knew exactly what the scraper was doing to the wood, and they trusted it completely. That kind of certainty only comes from generations of proven results. Now let me show you what is actually happening inside the wood when you scrape versus when you sand, because this is where everything clicks into place. When you run sandpaper across a board, the abrasive particles are doing something very specific at the cellular level. They are tearing. Each grit particle rips across the wood fibers, breaking them off at irregular points and leaving behind a surface that looks smooth to your eye, but is actually a landscape of torn, frayed, and upturned fiber ends. Think of it like dragging a rake across a field of grass. The tops get knocked around, some get ripped out, but the surface underneath is disturbed and ragged. Those torn fibers create thousands of tiny open channels leading directly into the wood's pore structure. And every single one of those channels is a pathway for moisture to enter. Now here is what a scraper does differently. A properly sharpened and burnished scraper does not tear the fibers, it shears them. The burr on the scraper edge acts like an incredibly fine knife, slicing the wood fibers cleanly at the surface and actually pressing the cell walls flat as it passes. Instead of ripping the grain open, it closes it. It burnishes it. The surface you are left with is not just smooth to the touch, it is genuinely sealed at the cellular level. The pores are pressed shut. The fiber ends are laid flat and tight against each other. This is why that mahogany transom I touched in Maine felt like polished stone. It was not just smooth, it was closed. The wood itself had been compressed and sealed by the action of the scraper. And that is something no amount of sanding can achieve, no matter how fine your grit. If you take 2 pieces of white oak, scrape one and sand the other to 320 grit, then set a single drop of water on each surface, you will see the difference in seconds. The sanded surface will absorb that water drop almost immediately. The scraped surface will beat it up and hold it on top. Same wood, same species, same board even. The only difference is how the surface was prepared. That is what those shipwrights understood, and that is why they refused to sand. Now, when I say scraper, I need to be clear about something. The scraper those shipwrights used is not the thin little cabinet scraper most of us have in our tool chest, that rectangular card of spring steel you flex with your thumbs. That is a fine tool and it has its place, but it is not what built the British Navy. Shipwright scrapers were heavy, purpose-built tools designed for serious material removal and final finishing on large surfaces. A deck scraper, for example, was typically a flat steel blade anywhere from 3 to 5 inches wide, set into a long wooden handle, sometimes 3 feet or more, so the worker could use it standing up and put real body weight behind each stroke. The blade itself was usually around 1/8 of an inch thick, sometimes more. Heavy enough to hold a burr for extended work without chattering or flexing. Then you had draw scrapers, which were pulled toward the body with both hands. These were common for finishing hull planks and cabin paneling. The blades were often curved to match the sweep of the hull, and shipwrights would keep a set of them in different radii for different sections of the vessel. Mast scrapers were another category entirely. These were shaped to wrap around a cylindrical surface, sometimes with a concave sole, so the scraper could follow the curve of a spar or mast as it was drawn along the length. Try doing that with sandpaper wrapped around a block, and you will immediately understand why they preferred steel. The key thing to understand is that the weight and rigidity of these tools is what made them work. A heavy scraper lets the burr do the cutting without the operator having to force it. The tool's own mass keeps it stable and in contact with the surface. That is something you cannot replicate with a thin, flexible card scraper on a large flat surface like a tabletop or a deck plank. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. This next part is the one that separates a scraper that works from a scraper that just pushes dust around. And honestly, it is where most people give up on scraping entirely, because if you get the edge wrong, the tool does nothing, and you assume scraping does not work. But when you get it right, it is like a completely different tool in your hands. Shipwrights prepared their scraper edges in 3 steps, and they did not skip any of them. First, they filed the edge perfectly square and straight using a mill file, not a slight bevel, not a rounded edge, dead square, 90 degrees to the face, with no light visible when you hold it against a straight edge. If this step is off, everything after it fails. Second, they honed both the face and the edge on a sharpening stone. In the old yards, this was typically a fine, natural stone, but today you can use anything from a water stone to a diamond plate. The goal is to polish the edge and remove the file marks so you are starting with clean, bright steel. They would lay the scraper flat on the stone and work the face until it was polished about a 1/4 inch back from the edge, then stand the scraper up and hone the edge itself until it was smooth and sharp enough that you could feel it catch your thumbnail. Third, and this is the critical step, they turned the burr using a burnisher. A burnisher is just a hard, polished steel rod. The shipwrights I watched used one about 5/16 of an inch in diameter, maybe 5 inches long, set in a wooden handle. You lay the scraper flat on the bench, hold the burnisher nearly flat against the face, and draw it along the edge with firm, even pressure. Then you gradually increase the angle, maybe 5 degrees at a time, until you have rolled a tiny hook of steel over the edge. That hook is your cutting edge. It is what does all the work. Here is where most people go wrong. They press too hard and roll too much burr too fast. A shipwright told me the burr should be so small, you can barely feel it with your fingernail. If you can see it, it is too much. A heavy burr digs in, chatters, and leaves tracks. A fine burr shears cleanly and leaves that glassy surface you are after. For softwoods like Douglas fir or longleaf yellow pine, which were common deck planking materials, they would use an even lighter burr than for hardwoods like teak or white oak. Less angle, less pressure, fewer passes with the burnisher. Now, let me tell you about something I never would have thought of on my own. How shipwrights checked their work. They did not have random orbit sanders with dust collection and halogen work lights. They had two things: raking light and their fingertips. Raking light means positioning a light source at an extreme angle to the surface, almost parallel to the wood. When you do this, every imperfection casts a shadow. Torn grain, scraper tracks, ridges, hollows, they all become visible instantly. The shipwrights would work with a lantern or a window positioned to throw light across the surface at the lowest possible angle, and they would check after every few passes. The fingertip test was even simpler, but takes practice to develop. You drag your fingertips very lightly across the surface, barely touching it, and you feel for any catch or roughness. A properly scraped surface will feel like one continuous plane. Your fingers will glide without catching anywhere. A sanded surface, by comparison, always has a subtle texture to it, a faint fuzziness that you learn to recognize once you know what a scraped surface feels like. I will be honest, the first few times I tried this, I could not tell the difference. But after a few weeks of paying attention, it became obvious. Now I can feel a sanded surface from across the room just by looking at how it catches the light. This next method is the one that convinced me to change how I finish every project. It is about what happens when you apply a finish over a scraped surface versus a sanded surface. When you brush or wipe oil, varnish, or any film-forming finish onto a sanded surface, the finish is flooding into all those torn, open pores and broken fiber channels. It absorbs deeply and unevenly. Some spots soak up more than others depending on how aggressively the sandpaper tore the grain in that area. This is why you often get blotchy results, especially on softwoods or ring-porous hardwoods. You end up needing more coats to build a consistent film because so much of your first and second coats disappeared into the damaged surface. On a scraped surface, the finish sits on top and absorbs slowly and evenly. The closed pores meter the absorption so the finish penetrates to a consistent, shallow depth across the entire surface. Your first coat goes further. Your second coat builds an even film, and the finished result has a depth and clarity that sanded surfaces simply cannot achieve. Shipwrights finishing teak decks would apply linseed oil or tung oil over a scraped surface and get a finish that lasted years in saltwater conditions. The same oil over a sanded surface would need reapplication in months. The difference was not the oil, it was the surface preparation. Modern marine varnishes and penetrating oils behave the same way. If you have ever wondered why your oil finish looks beautiful for 6 months and then starts to look tired and dry, the surface preparation is likely the reason. Let me share some patterns I've noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that shipwrights would have shaken their heads at. The first pattern is progressing through sandpaper grits as the default finishing method. Most of us do this because it is what we were taught. Start coarse, work your way up, and the surface gets smoother. But smoother is not the same as closed. You can sand to 400 grit and still have a surface full of torn, open fibers. You have just made them smaller. The second pattern is sanding end grain aggressively to try to get it smooth. End grain is the most vulnerable part of any board to moisture absorption, and sanding it tears those end fibers wide open. Shipwrights would scrape end grain with extreme care using a very fine burr, or they would seal it with a heavy coat of oil or tar before it ever saw weather. The third pattern is trusting the touch test after sanding. We run our hand across a sanded surface and think it feels smooth, so it must be finished. But what we are feeling is fuzz. Fine, soft, torn fibers that feel pleasant under the hand but are doing nothing to protect the wood. A scraped surface feels different, harder, slicker. Once you train your fingers to know the difference, you cannot go back. The fourth pattern is relying on the finish itself to seal the wood. Many of us apply finish as if it is the finish's job to close the pores and protect the surface. But the shipwrights understood that surface preparation is the first line of defense. The finish is the second. If the first line is compromised by torn grain, the finish has to work twice as hard and it will fail sooner. Once you see these patterns for what they are, you start to understand why a $5 scraper can outperform $100 worth of sandpaper discs. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is the burnishing trick I learned from one of the men at that boatyard in Maine, and I've never seen it in any woodworking book or video. When he turned his burr, he did not just burnish along the edge in one direction. He made his final 2 passes with the burnisher, moving from the center of the edge outward toward each corner, lifting the burnisher off the edge before reaching the very end. He said, "This prevents the burr from rolling over at the corners, which is where most scrapers start to leave tracks first. The corners stay sharp and uniform instead of hooking, and the scraper produces a consistent shaving across its full width." He also showed me a simple shop-made holder for card scrapers that turns them into something closer to a shipwright's deck scraper. Just 2 pieces of hardwood, about 8 inches long, clamped around the scraper with a pair of bolts, so the blade extends about 3/8 of an inch below the sole. The wooden body gives you mass, rigidity, and a flat reference surface. It takes about 20 minutes to make, and it completely transforms how a card scraper performs on a flat surface like a tabletop. I have been using mine for 5 years now, and it is one of the most useful jigs in my shop. Now, if this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries, the kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now or check the first link below. All right, let us continue. That is what those shipwrights knew that most of us were never taught. Scraping is not a primitive method that sandpaper replaced. It is a superior method that sandpaper made us forget. Pick up a scraper, learn to turn a proper burr, and the next time you finish a project, pay attention to how the wood feels and how the finish behaves. I think you will be as surprised as I was. Thanks for sticking with me today. I will see you in the next one.